this lineage of this government really begins in 2014 in a coup more or less orchestrated by the United States, where Biden himself actually had a hand in in what happened in the coup and the events afterwards.
And Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine. Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine.
In February last year, a deal was signed between the former Ukrainian president and the opposition to end the crisis peacefully. There were indeed foreign brokers present, but not from Washington. And despite the agreement, violence ensued. Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute believes Obama's admission sheds light on the murky truth of what happened.
Well, I think one thing that it says is the president can't get his story straight. There were probably a bunch of people having a heart attack in the State Department when he said that. But essentially it's true. What I wonder is if it's true on a different level than we even know, maybe the deal we brokered is something that the president and the U.S. State Department was doing behind the scenes while the EU was engaged in negotiating with Yanukovych and negotiating this sort of transition of power away from the president. As we know, that night was a very mysterious night. Everyone went to bed thinking that a deal was brokered to stave off the violence that followed, where we woke up in the morning and power had been seized by a group that was close to the U.S. So maybe he was telling more truth than he meant to tell in that statement.
Now, 1 year after the power change, Kiev remains stuck in a bloody conflict with those who are not happy with the new regime. Though the U.S. keeps on supporting Kiev with loans to prop up its war-torn economy and non-lethal equipment for its army. And it is considering sending lethal weapons. That's according to the chief of the U.S. military forces in Europe, while not showing up, though, at the recent round of peace talks.
We've been hearing this garbage for more than a decade. The U.S. claimed that the Orange Revolution was purely the action of Ukrainians who wanted a better life. And certainly there's an element of that in all color revolutions. There's an element of people who genuinely, A, want a better life and who doesn't, and B, who buy into the West propaganda that if you just do X, Y, or Z, you'll be living like the Swiss, rich and happy. That's always the case. But the reality is the U.S. has pumped in billions of dollars in Ukraine. We all know the quote from Newland that the U.S. has spent $5 billion promoting democracy in Ukraine. It's not even up for discussion. The U.S. financed the Orange Revolution, and Victoria Nuland and the State Department was heavily involved in this latest revolution in Ukraine.
Several videos have appeared on the web purporting to show English-speaking foreigners in Ukraine's army uniform in the port city of Mariupol.
Стоп, подождите, скажите, что это?
My face, please.
Now, this man was caught on camera as a journalist trying to question him on the situation in the city shortly after it was shelled. And here's another video.
Maybe explode, maybe not, so blow up in situ.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, the description under that video claims that the person in uniform seen at the start of the clip is American. However, I should say there is no proof that that is definitely the case. The details of the patch on his shoulder, they are indistinguishable, and the man's facial features cannot be made out. Other videos have previously emerged, those showing foreigners among the ranks of the Ukrainian National Guard, which is made up of volunteer troops.
Around 400 mercenaries from the private US security firm Academy are involved in the operation against anti-government activists in Ukraine. That is according to a report in the German newspaper Bild am Sonntag, citing an intelligence source. Earlier, the German intelligence service told the government about the mercenaries' involvement in the operation. However, it's not clear who commands and pays the private military contractors. Academy, previously known as Blackwater, gained notoriety after alleged atrocities committed during the Iraq War. The firm had earlier been accused of involvement in the Ukrainian crisis. An unverified video that supposedly shows US private contractors operating in the city of Donetsk emerged in March. The security company has not commented on the latest revelations, but previously denied any involvement in the Ukrainian crisis. What are your thoughts on these recent revelations? Why would the government in Kiev involve foreign mercenaries?
Well, I think you have a lot of Kiev-appointed oligarchs in the East who are very, very wealthy, and they have an interest in trying to quell this unrest. what's interesting about these last two stories we've seen about U.S. involvement is they've both come from major German newspapers, and it makes you wonder whether the Germans are not getting nervous that the U.S. is pushing this too far. We saw, for example, last week in Bild, a story that dozens of CIA officers were involved in helping put down the unrest in the East, and now we've seen this other story in a German paper. So I think under the surface, you're seeing a lot of very concerned German people and German businessmen.
The opposite argument is that the United States has defense treaties with the Philippines, with South Korea, with Japan. It doesn't have a defense treaty with the Ukraine. So arguably it ought to be being more robust in East Asia than with Ukraine. How would you respond to that perspective?
First of all, there was no question of a security treaty with Ukraine in recent years, and certainly not now. I think the situation is very different. I think in the case of Ukraine, we're dealing with an effort by an adjoining power to destabilize Ukraine internally for the purpose of subordinating it externally. That is the central objective. Now, how it's going to be sought, we do not know. I suspect that Putin's reaction to Ukraine was a product, in many respects, not of a strategic calculation, but of personal rage, after discovering that the West was outbidding the East in the courtship of Ukraine, not talked about, namely making a negotiating effort with Russia to deal with the sort of geopolitical problem that Ukraine poses for them and for us. I do think that we should be at the same time more open to help the Ukrainians defend themselves if they are attacked, because they'll only defend themselves if they're attacked, if they think we'll help them. So there is a kind of duality here. I'm not in favor of rushing forces into Ukraine or engaging in immediate massive shipments of weapons. But I certainly do think that if we are to deter the Russians from moving in, we have to convince the Russians that will be costly and prolonged. It will only be costly and prolonged if the Ukrainians fight. The Ukrainians will only fight if they think they will eventually get some help from the West, particularly in the kind of weaponry that would be necessary to wage a successful defense. They're not going to beat the Russians out in the open field, where thousands of tanks move in. They'll only beat them one way: prolonged urban resistance. Prolonged urban resistance. Then the war becomes costly. Then its economic costs escalate dramatically for the Russians. And then the war becomes futile politically. But to be able to defend a city, you have to have handheld anti-tank weaponry. You have to have handheld rockets. You have to have some organization to make it difficult. But city fighting is the most difficult and most costly kind of fighting for any partner engaged in a war, unless that partner is prepared to use weapons of total destruction, which obviously don't come into play here.
And Biden was literally made the most powerful man in the Ukraine.
And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they did. So they said they were walking out to the press conference. I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours. I looked, I said, leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a got fired.